Welcome everyone to another webinar from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Agricultural Profitability. My name is Ryan Evans with the Center for Ag Profitability, and we typically do these webinars every Thursday on a range of topics at this time, noon Central, and want to invite you to check out a schedule of all of our upcoming webinars and archives of past webinars that you can find on our website at cap.unl.edu/webinars. And today we're looking forward to discussing 2025 decisions related to farm programs, specifically ARC and PLC decisions. So we're happy to be working again with Nebraska FSA on today's webinar. And we invite any questions that you might have as we go through today to be submitted through the Q&A panel in your Zoom window. And we will work to have our panelists answer those before we wrap up today. And right now, I will turn it over to Dr. Brad Lubben, who's an extension policy specialist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He'll be part of leading this webinar and introducing our panelists from Nebraska FSA. So Brad.
Ryan, thank you for the introduction and thank you in a public way here for all the work you do that makes these webinars happen. We come up with ideas, we work with collaborators, and then all the detail happens, and we were able to carry off this webinar series on a weekly basis here. I'm pleased today to be able to talk about farm program details here for 2025, and to do so in collaboration with some great experts and some great colleagues from USDA's Farm Service Agency, Nebraska State Office. Dillon Breinig is a program specialist, and he'll be our featured presenter here to talk about some program details and sign-up procedures. But I also note Kathy Anderson, who is also a program specialist and a longtime friend and colleague over at FSA, and Bobby Criswickham, the public relations specialist at FSA, all help to work to help producers across the state. They work to get this information out the door, and we have been it has been great to work with him for actually several years here as we talk about farm program education on successive farm bills. Well, this is the year that we're talking about not a new farm bill, but another extension or a new extension of the existing farm bill. And so we have 2025 program decisions ahead of us with potentially very familiar programs, but maybe some new decisions or new economics driving some of the discussion this year. So I first am pleased to turn it over to Dillon and look forward to your presentation, Dillon, on some of the procedures and details. I'll follow up with some economic analysis and perspectives before we wrap up with some general Q&A as well. As Ryan noted, please enter any questions you might have in our Q&A box, and we'll monitor those and answer those as we can throughout the session here. So with that, Dillon, thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to turn my things off and listen to you here.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. Just to confirm before I get started, can you see my screen in my presentation, Brad or Ryan?
Yep, everything looks great. Perfect.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As Brad mentioned, my name is Dillon Breining. I'm a program specialist with Nebraska FSA State Office. I'm going to kick off our webinar here to go over the policy and procedure of the ARC PLC programs. I will add that before I get started, that there is very little has changed from an ARC PLC standpoint as far as how the program has been implemented over the past few years. So there may be some topics throughout my presentation here today that I go through very quickly. And that's mainly because that policy or that procedure that I'm referencing is unchanged for 2025. So the topics that I'll be going through today are the basics of each program, some examples of some payments, and then also our deadline information for ARC PLC. So to start off with, the ARC PLC program is considered our main commodity program that's under the safety net division of FSA. The ARC PLC program has been in place since the 2014 Farm Bill and has carried forward to the 2018 Farm Bill that recently expired back in 2023. The continuing resolution that was passed back on December 21st also included yet another extension of the Farm Bill, which included ARC PLC for 2025. Nothing new here as far as our ARC PLC options for producers for 2025. We still have the 3 options available, and they are ARC County, ARC Individual, and the Price Loss Coverage Program. Some additional policy reminders that also remain in place for 2025. If producers previously filed or signed a multi-year contract, there is no action needed unless you want to make an election change, or unless something has changed on the farm that would ultimately terminate that multi-year contract. In all cases, if you do not make an election for 2025, the elections in place for the 2024 program year will roll over. Regardless if a new election is made, a new contract must be completed by the April 15th deadline. And that election decision must be unanimous by all 2025 producers on the farm. Very quickly here, I'm just going to reference the covered commodities that are applicable for the ARC PLC program. Again, these remain unchanged for 2025. As you can see, corn, soybeans, grain, sorghum, and wheat. I would say those are primarily or commonly grown crops in Nebraska. Those are also still included as a covered commodity for ARC PLC purposes. So now that I've kind of went through a general overview of the ARC PLC program, some general information, now I'm going to start talking a little bit more about the individual programs within ARC PLC. Starting with the price loss coverage program. PLC is strictly a price protection program, and payments are triggered when the effective price for a crop year is less than the effective reference price. And most generally, if there are PLC payments that are triggered for the applicable year, those payments are typically issued after October 1 of the following year. It's also important to mention that similar to the prior ARC PLC signups, that PLC can be elected on a crop by crop basis. Again, very quickly going to touch on these. These are the PLC reference prices, or the reference prices that are statutorily set by the 2018 Farm Bill. Again, these remain unchanged, and they, like I said, are statutorily set, and they will not change for 2025. So next we're going to move on to, I'm going to briefly discuss the effective reference price, which is probably one of the biggest items to take a look at for program year 2025. And that's because of the impacts that it has on all the ARC PLC programs. So the 2018 Farm Bill included the addition of a new mechanism called the effective reference price. And that is, and like I mentioned, this is applicable to all ARC PLC programs. And, you know, kind of due to my limitations of time here, I won't go through the entire process of how the effective reference price is calculated on this slide. But just keep in mind that the effective reference price can be greater than the statutory reference price that is set with the Farm Bill. In past years, the effective reference price has most generally been equal to the crop's reference price. But due to higher trending commodities during this period in which we're looking at, these effective reference prices can change. I will review the effective reference prices that are in place for 2025 on the next slide. But as I mentioned before, just keep in mind that these effective reference prices, they can be greater than those 2018 Farm Bill prices. So as I just mentioned, the effective reference price uses historical data and Farm Bill reference prices. So therefore, the 2025 ARC PLC effective reference prices have already been established. The table on this slide is reflecting these effective reference prices that will be used for the 2025 ARC PLC program year. You will notice that the effective reference price for wheat, grain, sorghum, and soybeans along with a few others, will be higher than the statutory reference price. Again, as they're established in the Farm Bill. Specifically looking at the more common commodities grown in Nebraska, the effective reference price for corn is $4.26, $9.66 for soybeans, and then $4.51 for grain sorghum. So before we start looking at the payment calculation for each program, I wanted to first cover the PLC effective price, the effective price, and then also the market year average price. The PLC effective price represents the price received for a crop in a specific year. The PLC effective price is compared to the effective reference price to determine if there's a price loss that ultimately determines if a PLC payment is triggered. The effective price is simply the higher of the market year average price or the national loan rate. In recent years, most typically, the market year average price has been used for ARC PLC purposes. The market year average price is the national weighted average of all prices received during the marketing year following harvest. So for example, the marketing year for corn is September 1 through August 31st. And obviously, this is determined separately for each commodity. So just as as a refresher for the PLC program, here is the calculation for that. We simply take the effective reference price minus the effective price, which ultimately determines our PLC payment rate. And just as a note here, again, for our more commonly grown commodities in Nebraska, there were no PLC payment rates for these crops listed in program year 2023. So once we take a look at the payment formula, this is kind of a breakdown of the payment. If there is a PLC payment triggered, this is the farm level PLC payment and how it's calculated. We simply take the PLC payment rate times the farm established PLC yield times the payment acres, which equals the PLC payment on the farm. And the payment acres, those equal 85% of the base acres that are established and applicable to the specific farm. Moving into an example with some figures, and just to reiterate this is an example just for this webinar and training purposes that I've used in the past. But it does include, this example does include the effective reference price that's established for 2025 for corn. And so that price is $4.26. The hypothetical effective price of $3.81. Which gives us a PLC payment rate of 45 cents a bushel. Moving on with the example, on this farm, we have 425 base acres of corn. We take that times 85% to give us our payment acres, times 165, which is the PLC yield on the farm, times the PLC payment rate of 45 cents, which gives us $26,823 for that PLC payment. Next, I'm going to go over the next option for ARC PLC, which is ARC County. So ARC County is an income support based or on a benchmark or expected county crop revenue level. The benchmark revenue is guaranteed at 86%. The ARC County program uses county level yields and national average prices to determine the benchmark and actual revenues by crop. So ARC County payments for a crop are triggered when the actual county revenue falls below the 86% guarantee. So for ARC County, revenue losses, as I mentioned, are determined for a crop independent of other crops on the farm. Similar to PLC, the crop does not have to be planted on the farm, and payments are issued at 85% of the farm's base acres. And similar to PLC, producers are not required to report the production on ARC County enrolled farms to FSA. The benchmark revenue for ARC County remains unchanged from prior years. The benchmark revenue for ARC County uses the Olympic average method, which looks at historical price and yield data from the 5 years prior to the preceding year of the program year. So, for example, for program year 2025 ARC PLC, the yield and price data that we're going to be using for this this program year would be 2019 through 2023. I should also note that the high and low figures are dropped in the Olympic average calculation, and that's done at both levels for the yield and the price. So the final step in the ARC County payment calculation, if you will, is determining the actual revenue. The county level actual revenue for a crop is determined by multiplying actual average county yield for the crop times the higher of the marketing year average price or the national loan rate. Similar to the benchmark revenue, the actual revenue uses RMA or NAS as the source for the county level yield data. This is similar to the PLC program as well, where we're looking at the higher of the market year average price or the national loan rate. And as I mentioned in my review of PLC, most typically in the past, due to higher trending commodities, the market year average price has been used. The ARC County guarantee is 86% of the benchmark revenue. It's also important to note that the ARC County payment rate has a cap associated with it, or a maximum payment rate, and that payment rate is calculated at 10% of the ARC County benchmark revenue. Moving through a quick example here. First, we're going to look at the actual ARC County revenue calculation. So we have 135, an actual county average yield of 135 for corn, times the higher of the market year average price of the national loan rate, or the market year average price of 380, which gives us our actual crop revenue of $513 per acre. And then next, we're going to review this slide, I guess, to ultimately determine if there was a crop revenue loss. So the ARC County actual crop revenue loss is less than the guarantee. So we can see a crop revenue loss in this example of $18.39 per acre. In this example, the calculated payment rate is less than the ARC County benchmark revenue cap of 10%. Therefore, the ARC County payment rate will remain at $18.39 per acre. Moving through a quick farm level example of the payment, now that we've determined the payment for ARC County. Again, we have 100 base acres of corn on this farm, times our payment factor or payment acres for ARC County of 85%, which gives us 85 times the share of the producer's share on the contract, times the crop loss, which ultimately gives us a total payment on this farm of $1,563. Just some quick some final comments from an ARC County perspective here. So ARC County also has criteria for using separate irrigated and non-irrigated yields to determine revenues and payment rates. So as I mentioned as mentioned on this slide, just keep in mind within ARC County guidelines, there is some criteria for using separate irrigated and non-irrigated county yields. So we look at this data, or FSA looks at this data, and if a county meets the criteria of using irrigated and non-irrigated yields, a HIP factor, or a historical irrigated percentage, will be determined for the applicable crops on each farm in the county using those FSA irrigated and non-irrigated yields. And those are determined based on the acreage reporting data that's available to us from the years 2013 through 2017. The HIP factor is used to determine the number of base acres used in calculating both the irrigated revenue and the non-irrigated revenue. The HIP factor, if there is one applicable to the farm, that remains in effect for the 2025 ARC PLC program year. Moving on to the last slide I have here for ARC County. So the 2018 Farm Bill also outlined that the ARC County revenues will be calculated based on the farm's physical location, as determined by each tract associated with the farm. So this policy, again, remains in place for 2025. So just keep in mind that if you have a farm that has land physically located in multiple counties, that those revenues will be weighted and summarized at the farm level to determine the overall revenue for each commodity. So the last option, or the final program option I'm going to discuss today, is ARC IC, which is ARC Individual. ARC IC is considered a whole farm revenue coverage option that is unique in its own way because the revenues are weighted for all covered commodities that are planted to determine the farm's overall gains and losses. As reflected on this slide, ARC IC is unique because producers electing this option must have at least 1/100th of an acre planted to a covered commodity on the farm to determine those revenue gains or losses for the ARC IC crops. There is one exception within the ARC IC policy and the procedure that farms where all covered commodities are 100% approved for prevent planting are still considered eligible for potential ARC IC benefits. If a revenue loss occurs, ARC IC payments are issued on 65% of the farm's base acres. Along with the planting requirement, ARC IC also requires production to be reported to FSA as well. So as I mentioned before, ARC IC provides income support to producers who plant any of the 22 covered commodities that I reviewed earlier. And that is regardless of whether the base acres for that commodity exist on the farm. So producers on an ARC IC enrolled farm who do not share in the farm's planted covered commodities are eligible for ARC IC payments. This information, or the shares on the ARC IC contracts, are captured by us during acreage reporting season when the FSA 578 is filed. So as I mentioned earlier, producers are required to report production on farms enrolled in ARC IC. Production on farms enrolled in ARC IC are required to be reported by July 15th in the year following that crop year. So in addition to providing current year production, it's a good reminder to mention on here that producers must also provide historical yield data to establish the benchmark period revenues. So ARC IC yields, this is a little different than ARC County and how ARC County functions, but for ARC IC yields are certified as a blended yield to include production from both irrigated and non-irrigated acres. Production from covered commodity acres that are hayed or grazed, those acres must have a conversion factor applied to determine the production and convert those commodities to a grain basis. As I mentioned earlier, ARC IC payment acres are 65% of the total base acres on the farm. So ARC IC payments are triggered when the current year revenue from all planted covered commodities on the producer's ARC IC farms fall below the guarantee for the ARC IC farm. Another important item to remember is that an ARC IC farm is defined as a producer's share of all planted covered commodities from all ARC IC enrolled farms in the state. So since ARC IC factors a producer's interest in all enrolled ARC IC farms in a state, revenues from one farm or crop can potentially eliminate the revenue loss from another farm or another crop. So each producer on the ARC IC farm will have a unique benchmark revenue calculated across all planted covered commodities. For example, a landowner or an operator could have multiple farms enrolled in ARC IC and have a different share of the covered commodities across those farms. Therefore, those in those situations where each individual has a different share or entity has a different share, those are situations that could impact both the benchmark revenue and actual revenue. Moving through a quick ARC IC example where we need to determine a weighted benchmark revenue because the wheat and barley were planted on this farm in this example. The percent of planted covered commodities is calculated by taking the commodity acres divided by the total planted covered commodity. The benchmark revenue for each crop has been determined in this example. We then take that figure and multiply that times the percent of the planted covered commodities to reach our weighted farm benchmark revenue of $270.58 per acre. The guarantee in this example will then be $232.70, which would be 86% of the weighted farm benchmark revenue. So now that we've have established our weighted benchmark and guarantee revenue per acre, next we're going to calculate the producer's actual revenue and loss. The producer has certified the actual yield for wheat was 35 bushels per acre, and his barley yield was 48. The market year average price in this example was higher than the national loan rate, so the market year average price is used. We then take the yield times the price times the number of acres planted to determine our actual crop revenue for each commodity, which then gives us a total crop revenue on the farm of $314,480. Simple math to break this down to revenue per acre, we take that figure divided by the total acres planted, which gives us our weighted revenue per acre. Since this producer has 100% share of the covered commodities planted on the farm, the producer's average revenue per acre is the same as the weighted average revenue per acre. From here, we can identify that the producer had a loss. We take the weighted guarantee calculated on the previous slide minus the producer's average revenue per acre, which gives us a loss of $36.15 per acre. The 10% ARC IC benchmark revenue cap of $27.06 would be the payment rate in this example, since it is less than the producer's actual loss per acre. Moving on to an ARC IC payment at the farm level. Remember that ARC IC pays on 65% of the base acres on the farm. So in this example, there's 750 total bases on the farm. Take that times 65%, which gives us 487.5 payment acres. Again, the producer has 100% share of the covered commodities on this farm. So we take those payment acres times the ARC IC payment rate, which gives us our ARC IC payment of $13,192. To kind of finish up, so to break all this information down, here's a quick reference guide with some key talking points about the ARC PLC programs that producers can consider when making an election. I will quickly note that the ARC PLC program does include provisions for producers who plant fruits and vegetables. The planting of fruits and vegetables on payment acres enrolled in ARC and PLC program is permitted. However, if fruits and vegetables are planted on payment acres as it relates to ARC PLC, there is an acre for acre reduction that would apply. As I finish up here, just some general reminders for everyone. So the deadline for ARC PLC election enrollment for 2025 is April 15th. Like I mentioned before, if no new election is made, the 2024 elections will roll over to 2025. However, regardless of whether a new election is made, a new contract is required. On my final note for today, I just wanted to mention is if producers are interested in SEO coverage through RMA, the deadline to obtain that coverage is currently still March 15th of 2025. If producers are considering SEO coverage for 2025, we just want to reiterate to please ensure you consult with your crop insurance agent on how this coverage could impact ARC PLC elections for 2025. Just to finish up here, I know I kind of went through some of my slides rather quickly, but this last slide here is our contact information here at the Nebraska State Office, and then also a link to our local service centers as well. And then I've also included some additional resources through farmers.gov, and then also a website for our ARC PLC program data website. Like I said, I know I went through some of this stuff rather quickly, but if you have any questions, or if producers, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you all have. So with that being said, I appreciate all your time today, and I will turn it over to Brad.
Dillon, thank you very much. But before I open up my presentation, I have a couple questions for you. One that's come in here. Could you address again or discuss the issue of ARC County results for irrigated versus non-irrigated, and how that actually turns into a calculation of a payment on a farm that would have blended acres between the two?
So are you referring to the historical irrigated percentage, Brad?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So the historical irrigated percentage, that has been a factor, and Kathy might have to correct me if I'm wrong here, going back to, I believe it's the 2018 Farm Bill. And so we have policy in one ARC PLC that looks at not only our crop acreage reporting data that's filed with FSA, but also data with RMA. And ultimately, we have criteria within the ARC PLC policy that determines whether a county meets the criteria of using irrigated and non-irrigated yields, and that is by crop. Those counties, those irrigated and non-irrigated designations, they don't change, or they have not changed since the 2018 Farm Bill, and those are crop specific. We have actually an exhibit in our handbook that outlines the commodities and the counties that are classified or that meet the criteria for irrigated and non-irrigated yields.
Mm-hmm.
And those HIPs, those historical irrigated percentages, those are established based on 2013 through 2017 acreage reporting data. Those are how that's how those percentages are established.
Okay. And so that clarifies that just because the county level, ARC County might trigger a payment at the irrigated or a payment rate at the non-irrigated practice, any actual payment on the farm is a function of their blended results between irrigated and non-irrigated according to their historical percentage, right?
I believe that's correct. Yes.
So if you're an irrigated, non-irrigated producer, I sort of liken it to enterprise coverage on your crop insurance policy. This unit may pay, that unit may not pay, but when you blend them together as an enterprise, it's a blended result that determines whether there's a payment or not. So
within our county, if there is a HIP value that's applicable to that farm, the revenues are calculated separately, but they're weighted and summarized at the farm level to determine an overall ARC County payment on that farm.
Okay.
So like you said, there's a weighted average, or there's a weighted calculation within that uses that HIP factor to determine the overall farm payment rate. If it's applicable. So
okay. All right. A second quick question, if we might, and we're stacking up some more questions that we'll get to as well, but a second quick question. As you noted, and there's that linkage between your ARC PLC decision and your potential decision about the supplemental coverage option, the crop insurance policy SCO, with two different dates here now for FSA sign up deadline of April 15th and a crop insurance spring deadline of March 15th. Is there some sort of automatic trigger, or how does someone determine that you're either ineligible for SCO because you've signed up for ARC, or how do those triggers happen if they do?
So we don't have the capability at the local level to know if a producer has elected or obtained SEO coverage. So, for example, if a producer has corn, soybeans, and wheat base on a farm and they've previously elected or obtained SEO coverage on wheat, we're not notified in any way, at least from a local level or even a state level, that producer has obtained SEO coverage. So our guidance that we've received and that we've relayed out to our county offices is, if producers are considering SEO coverage, that they need to visit with their crop insurance agent and to discuss the potential impacts on ARC PLC elections.
So the likely compliance that happens is really on the insurance side. Maybe they confirm the sign up for farm programs and then determine whether SEO is an eligible option or not. So,
Correct.
okay.
And the basis for that is we just don't have the capability to know at the local level what type of insurance options the producer has obtained. So.
Right. Well, and it has to happen somewhere. So
yeah.
So it's on that side. Okay, fantastic. All right, I'm going to share my presentation and get rolling here. Let me confirm, are you seeing that okay? Dillon or Ryan, is the presentation showing okay?
It's still loading.
Loading, okay. Don't have full control of it yet, it seems here.
I'm going to stop your sharing, Brad, and see if you can try.
Okay.
Brad, are you still with us?
I am with you, but looks like my computer is freezing up here. Zoom is freezing up on me.
There, you're back.
Okay. All right. Am I with you okay?
Yep.
But I'm not sharing, right?
Correct.
Let's try this again. Am I sharing okay?
Yes, it looks good.
Hey, fantastic. Okay. Computers always pick their own time frame to when they should update or slow down for something. So happy to have slides showing up with us. Okay, I want to talk through the farm program details here from maybe an economic perspective. Dillon, thank you very much for the detail and the specifics on procedures and mechanisms and sign up. This will be a little more of a story of what the economics tell us today and why this year may look a little bit different than it did the last couple of years. We could briefly talk about where the farm bill's at, but just recognize that because of the inability to get a new farm bill across the finish line in either 23 or 24, we're dealing now with the second year of an extension of the existing 2018 farm bill. And while we have the second year extension here, we effectively have some new conditions that may lead to a new decision. That is, it's not the same decision. It's not the same obvious choice that you might have made the year before or the year before that. The economic conditions continue to change here, and that might mean that this decision has changed as well. The outlook here for 2025 is, at least at the moment, a little bit of a cash flow question as we deal with some lower commodity prices and some tightening margins. Cash flow questions that include the 2024 crop program that's already from the past year, but payments in that program that would come later this year in October, and the 2025 decision that we're talking about today. There is also some emergency assistance, some ag disaster assistance and economic assistance that was passed in late 2024. That's not part of today's detail here specifically, but I'll mention them in passing here at the end because they are substantial in their own right And that is also part of the expected cash flow here in 2025. And of course, the 2025 Farm Bill debate theoretically begins anew here with a new Congress that has convened in Washington, and a new debate that faces its own set of challenges here to try and get to the finish line this year. If we briefly look back at the 2024 program that is due to make payments in October of this year, right now, if we were to project, we don't expect payments under the PLC program for anybody that signed up for PLC. There are some commodities that might, but for the main commodities here in Nebraska, we generally don't expect payments if we finish the marketing year at the projected prices that we see. That was the projected price from USDA's World Ag Outlook Board as of mid-January. A $4.25 price for corn would not trigger a PLC payment when we have a 401 price as our effective trigger price. It would take about a 6% loss from current levels, so not a big loss before we might imagine triggering PLC payments. So they're out of the money, so to speak, but they're relatively close. On the other hand, we are 5 months, almost 5 months into the marketing year, and generally more than half of the commodity has already been marketed by this point. So the ability to dramatically change the season average price is already dwindling rather quickly here. For other commodities, PLC looks much the same. It would take a modest loss in the season average price to imagine triggering payments. But if you look in that next column, the far column to the right, some of these programs are effectively in the money at this point or at the money for purposes of a potential ARC payment. That's assuming that you hit average yields and recognize the price movements that we've had. So if you have average yields and these prices, corn is just 2% out of the money. It's almost right there. Grain sorghum is in the money under current prices and average yields. Of course, we know ARC is a function of revenue, so higher yields would effectively lower the effective price protection. Lower prices certainly would trigger here. So you get a sense of not big payments projected for the 2024 crop year to be paid later this year, but yet a safety net that's very close and very relevant for producers at the moment. If I move forward to 2025, then we have new numbers to look at, and that's what changes the outlook here. The effective reference price that Dillon mentioned for corn is $4.26 a bushel. If we have a projected market year average price, and you move over enough columns and you see a number that says $3.90, well, I'm not confident enough or brave enough or maybe stupid enough to try and predict market prices, but fundamentally, that's a number that comes out of some very early supply and demand baseline numbers that USDA publishes on an annual basis. Those numbers were created back in November. They're the basis of some publications that will come out here in February. If we see a $3.90 price, if we see further weakness in commodity prices, then the PLC payment is substantial under the 2025 crop program year. A $4.26 price minus a $3.90 reference price is a 36-cent potential PLC payment. Again, I'm not predicting a $3.90 price, but just to note that we're substantially in the money already. And we're in the money for grain sorghum as well. We're near the money for soybeans and wheat. So PLC is a bigger safety net this year than it's been in the last few years. For the ARC program, you see that we're in the money for corn and sorghum and soybeans. The effective reference price in the ARC program, if you start with a benchmark price of 503 in that guarantee, and you take 86% of the benchmark, you have an effective reference price of 432. That's my economic shorthand to say that that's the price where ARC would trigger if we had just average or benchmark yields. 432 versus a 390, there's a 42-cent potential payment at average yields that's already effectively in the money. So the ARC program is substantial for 2025. Even wheat is sort of at the money, even though the guarantees have been lower thus far. So the question here for 2025 is, should I look at PLC? Should I look at ARC? I have some numbers in there for SCO as well, and you can reference back to those, but I'll talk about those in a graph to come. But if I reference PLC and ARC, which one is a stronger safety net? Well, they work differently. Let's consider ARC. ARC, remember, protects revenue. And so it's a combination of prices and yields that might trigger an ARC payment. I have a price of $3.90 there in the middle. That was that predicted or projected price from USDA's early supply and demand work. I have a yield of 200 in the middle. I just picked 200. It's not an average. The state average in Nebraska would be closer to perhaps a 180, 185, but 200 is nice math. Okay. If you take a benchmark price that we saw that was 503 times 200, that'll give you $1,006 benchmark level. We protect 86% of that. And so if the yield price combination falls below that guarantee, payments come under the ARC program. If yields and prices or the combination of are high enough, you don't end up with payments because you have good crop revenue. That's the lower right-hand corner of that table. But if yields and prices fall, either a yield drop at existing prices or a price drop at existing yields, or a combination of both, suddenly we see big revenue losses quickly, and we even quickly sort of move into the territory where the ARC program maxes out. If the benchmark is $1,006 in this example, then the maximum is 10% of that, $100.60. And so you can envision scenarios where yield losses or price losses or both quickly trigger an ARC payment. Compare that to the PLC program. If the PLC projected price, again using corn as an example here, is the PLC effective reference price is 426, then at 429 or above, well, at 426 or above, there are 0 payments, regardless of yield. PLC will not give you any sort of yield protection the same way that ARC will. It will start triggering only if prices fall below that reference point. So if we see a drop to 390, as is the projection, we could see some rather large PLC payments. If we see drops that go further and further and further, we could see very big PLC payments. We actually would get to a point where we'd also have to remember there are payment limits, and those could affect total payments that a producer might receive. But fundamentally, you can get a sense of when ARC would trigger versus when PLC would trigger. So the question might be, well, which one pays more? Or at least that's sort of the first economic question. So this is a graph of the same numbers, but it's the ARC payment rate minus the PLC payment rate over the same range of yields and prices. There is a range in there in blue where the ARC payment rate is much higher than the PLC payment rate. That's where revenue drops, but prices don't. So yield dropped, but prices didn't. There's even some modest yield losses, price losses where ARC would pay more than the PLC program. But then you can also see places where PLC would pay more than ARC. Very deep price losses, or price losses even when yields are higher than average. And so you can sort of paint corners of this potential distribution about where one program looks stronger than the other program, but you also have to be thinking in your mind about which one fundamentally is most likely to occur. Where do we end up? We generally end up close to projected prices and projected yields, and we generally have a somewhat, concentrated distribution around those points. But you have to give some thought to what is the potential of ending up somewhere else in that distribution. So I try and summarize it this way, and this references back to Dillon's discussion of the program detail. ARC provides revenue protection, but it only provides it for shallow losses. It kicks in at 86%, but it also kicks out at 76%. And so it covers you part of the way down, and that may be sufficient to cover almost all of the projected risk I might face. How much risk do I really have below 76? Do I marry it up with a crop insurance decision on a farm that already protects me at that level and lower? That's something to consider when you're trying to determine how ARC fits. If it's about PLC, remember that it's fundamentally about price protection, and it protects you from lower prices. It does not help you any way with yield potential or with potential yield losses. But if price losses are deep enough, we certainly could imagine a scenario where PLC would pay more than ARC would pay. There is also the kicker that says, well, PLC may not give me everything that ARC does, but if I sign up for PLC, I might consider SCO as well. That's the insurance decision, the supplemental coverage option. And so there are questions about where those things might actually fit. Let me first sort of describe this ARC versus PLC decision and think back over time. In 2014, we first had this decision, and the effective price protection level in ARC was around 455 or so. The effective PLC protection was at the statutory reference price of 370. With much stronger protection in ARC versus PLC, it's not surprising that almost everybody chose ARC. By 2019 and 2020, when we had our next decision, the tables had turned. The PLC protection was still at 370, but the ARC protection, because prices had come down, which meant that the average had come down, which meant that the benchmark had come down, which meant that the protection levels had come down. The protection level in ARC was around 318 a bushel. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of producers switched from ARC to PLC. Since that time, we've been a little bit more mixed in our decision making, but as we've seen higher price projections or higher prices over the last several years, neither ARC nor PLC has been a substantial part of the safety net for producers. The last sign up here in 2024, we ended up at 76% enrolled in ARC, but now 2025 presents us with a scenario where ARC and PLC look actually pretty close in terms of where they would provide protection, and both of them look pretty important to producers this year. Of course, then there's that decision about, but what is SCO's role in this? And this is not an insurance webinar, so it's not much detail or too much detail on SCO, but SCO is an option, and it provides you a county level protection to stack on top of your individual insurance policy. If you buy revenue protection at the individual level, then SCO becomes a revenue policy. And because of the levels where it kicks in and kicks out, it could look an awful lot like ARC, except that importantly this year, SCO starts at 86% of the insurance price. ARC effectively kicks in at 86% of a benchmark price. They sound like they kick in at the same place, but they don't. They're separate prices. And so I show you this chart to reference. We have the same PLC reference price in red, and it's gone up for 2025 to 426 for corn. We have the same, what I call effective price protection level for ARC, and it's up there at, I believe, what, 433 or so. And then we have what I'm calling the SCO effective price. That is 86% of the insurance price. That's where SCO would kick in if you had average yields in the county. When prices are high, insurance looks like a much stronger safety net than the commodity program. When prices are falling, and that commodity program is tied to a historical moving average or a fixed protection level, suddenly the farm programs are kicking in at higher levels than what insurance may do this year. So if you're trying to figure out how these programs work, which one's more valuable, which one provides more protection, the table has turned this year, and the farm programs become the first to trigger compared to the others. That's true for corn. That's true for soybeans. It's even true for wheat. And so we have those decisions to think about. Now, a brief discussion, a very brief discussion as our time draws short, about some ad hoc assistance. And we'll make this brief because we may also come back to this in future webinars as details are out there. But we do have, as passed in the same legislation in December that included a one-year extension of the Farm Bill, we have $21 billion approved for ag disaster assistance across the country for losses in 23 and 24. That largely might be a function of projected hurricane losses and a response to that, but it certainly includes all ag disaster losses as well. We also see $10 billion in economic assistance relative to the 2024 crop year. We did not see a new farm bill in 2024, even as ag groups were calling for a stronger safety net as part of the discussion, perhaps in part because that stronger safety net did not come in. There was a push for economic help in the meantime, and the $10 billion in economic assistance is perhaps that answer. Well, the ag disaster assistance, here are some details. The only thing that the legislation really said is to effectively carry out the assistance for 2023 and 2024 with reference to the provisions that were used in 21 and 22. That references back to a period when FSA was rolling out the Emergency Relief Program. And so we could envision scenarios where the details and the procedures are much like that, but it is too early to really confirm that that'll be how it happens. Regardless of the exact methodology and detail yet to come, it certainly does offer potential hundreds of millions of dollars of assistance to Nebraska relative to some of the losses that we saw in 23 and 24. The timeline there remains uncertain. We don't have details of when. We have some expectations certainly that this will help with 25 cash flow, but we can't promise when. Relative to the economic assistance, the legislation actually included some detailed equations. It calculated a projected loss based on a national average harvested yield for 24 times a national market year average price predicted for 24. That gave you a total return. It subtracted a national average, national projected production cost that calculated a margin. And if there was a loss, the payment rate was to be calculated at 26% of that loss. That's how those numbers in the first column of the table there to the right were calculated. Those are estimates nationally, but that's how those numbers were calculated. This would theoretically be paid on any planted acre in 2024, as well as 50% of any prevent planted acres in 2024 for all of the program commodities. We don't have all of the production cost estimates at the national level for all of our program commodities. So we don't even have final sort of official calculations yet. And we don't even have a total sort of documentation of acreage. We have estimates of planted acreage and maybe prevent planted acreage from FSA acreage reporting in 24, but there could be acres that were planted that were not reported from a producer that was not participating in the program. So we don't have necessarily final details on payment rates or even total acres. Thus, the rates that are shown there are somewhat estimated at this point, and you might conservatively estimate some percentage of that, but it is substantial again, and 600 million plus in projected payments here in Nebraska. The legislation suggests or says that this would be carried out within 90 days. That presumes that all of this detail can be figured out and that payments could start rolling out the door in March. I'm not going to ask my FSA friends and colleagues if that will come to pass exactly on that date, but fundamentally it will be prompt, and we expect it to be. But there will be some procedures to deal with producers that would also still have to sign up for this. So we leave that discussion, and as we close down on our presentation here before we go into overtime, let's call it, for some questions, fundamentally recognize that we have some very important decisions ahead of us for 25. We still have a farm bill debate yet to happen in 2025. And so there are some questions about what's ahead with the farm bill. That's fundamentally about the 2026 crop year ahead as well. There's a farm bill debate. There are many other issues on the horizon as well for another discussion at another time. But it's fair enough to say that the farm bill is not the only thing on the radar these days for ag producers, but the decision that you have now at FSA about which enrollment option to choose and to make sure you sign up is an important consideration for producers. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to invite Dillon to come back on screen, if he will, and we're going to roll through some Q&A. And I believe many questions have been answered here directly to the attendees, but let's see what we have here for the open discussion. There was one question popped up, and so it's worth referencing. Will these slides be available? Yes, the slides will go up on the website with the archived version of the webinar. Those will go up here shortly, maybe 1 or 2 days, depending upon our great communications expertise from Ryan. But those will be available soon on that webinar webpage. UNL does not specifically have a what if spreadsheet. I can point to my friends and colleagues down at Kansas State University who have produced a a spreadsheet, and with a good one already on the shelf, we haven't tried to replicate or duplicate that work. The spreadsheet can show you, a what if tool can show you what the potential payments are. It could show you how payments might differ under the choices, in different yield and price scenarios. One thing it doesn't show you is any sort of expectation of probability. I showed you those tables I calculated that showed what payment rates would do under higher or lower yields or prices. I don't have a probability attached to those outcomes. A very low price and very low yield scenario is very, very unlikely. But it shows up in the chart like an equal box compared to average yields and average prices. So you want to look at those what ifs, or look at those calculations, and recognize that the real question is, how likely in your mind is it that prices might fall to a certain level? And maybe the interpretation I can offer in corn is ARC pays quicker under any sort of price loss. PLC eventually pays more if price losses are deep enough, but it would take a price drop to about 360 or so a bushel before PLC would pay more than ARC. What's the likelihood that prices drop below 360 a bushel? It's probably, unfortunately, above zero, but it's still pretty small. And if you wanted to imagine how likely it was, just note that I looked up options prices on the futures market, and a 360 option wasn't even trading, but if a 360 put option was priced, it'd be somewhere less than 4 cents a bushel. In other words, the market doesn't think there's very much likelihood of falling that far. So how much probability do we put on those outcomes? That's something that the individual has to figure out. The American Relief Act, in reference to planted acres, this is planted acres of program commodities. So it will not cover non-program crops. It is only planted acres on the same basic program commodities that are supported by commodity programs. That's the major grains and oil seeds we see, plus some minor oil seeds, plus some pulse crops. But fundamentally, that's the limit of that. There was a question earlier that must have been answered okay, but there's some question of how can one find details about this. Dillon, can you reference how producers can find details on the ARC and PLC programs on the FSA website?
Yeah, so my last slide there in my presentation, there's an ARC PLC program data website, and that's a really good resource for producers to access. There's various reports that are available on that public website, including prior. I see there's a lot of questions about ARC County and irrigated and non-irrigated counties. There's also a report that Bobby referenced in that chat there on the ARC PLC public website, where producers can access those reports and look at those prior payment rates for ARC County and for all programs, really. So that is one option that producers can utilize are those reports on the public facing website.
Okay. Well, that's an important note to say that FSA has a great deal of information on their website, as one would expect, but there is substantial information there that documents things as we go. So there are these yield and price histories that produce the ARC benchmark numbers. There are effective PLC reference prices. There will be price projections during the marketing year. Of course, the 2025 crop marketing year begins in September for the main commodities, begins in July for or August for wheat. But fundamentally, there are projections as we go along. And so even on the FSA website itself, there would be data you could use to calculate potential payments as the day gets closer.
Yeah, and specifically for 2025, Brad, the 2025 benchmark, ARC County benchmark revenues have already been posted to that
Right.
website. And like you just mentioned, I will also mention from a PLC standpoint, the national office loads those reports to that website. And there's also a report within that website and it's titled as the projected PLC payment rates. That, of course, is not available for 2025 yet. As you mentioned, the marketing year for the covered commodities has not begun yet. So
Yeah.
I anticipate in the future, unfortunately, probably after, the ARC PLC sign up has closed on April 15th, that those projected PLC payment rates probably won't be available until later
Yeah.
in the.
Right. And I would say from the economic side, we're hesitant to have much confidence in any projected payment rates. I showed you a table where they would trigger or how far out of the money they are relative to a current projected price, but recognize that that is a projected price that's used in some supply and demand analysis as part of USDA's Ag Outlook baseline that they publish every February. So that is a very sort of crystal ball look at what's ahead. It does not assume major shocks or shifts in trend or shifts in policy. And between the time that those numbers were discussed in November and the time they're published in February, and by the time that they actually matter in terms of program calculations, we could have any number of shifts and shocks and everything else. And so it's a very premature, or at least a very early look at what projections could be coming down the road, but it is not a solid estimate of something to cash flow at this point. Well, I believe we have gotten through the questions that were posted, and thanks to our support here as well with Kathy Anderson and Bobby Chris Wickham from FSA and Ryan Evans here on the Center for Ag Profitability side to answer many of those questions with reference to reports that are available and other resources. As noted, this webinar, an archive version of this webinar and the slides that went with it will be available online here soon. I expect within 1 or 2 days. But you'll be available to see that. And of course, we all remain as resources and look forward to working with you as you might have questions. The discussion on the emergency assistance is likely to be a topic of another webinar on another day. And we look forward to working with FSA again as that detail comes out. So with that, however, I would close here for the day and thank you for your time and participation. For those that are still with us here past the 1 o'clock hour Central, thank you for your time and engagement and involvement. Thank you, Dillon, particularly for your work and efforts to share the detail and the specifics of the ARC and PLC programs. And thank you again for the collaboration between Nebraska Extension and our Center for Ag Profitability and our USDA Farm Service Agency Nebraska office. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you and visit with you today, and we hope that you'll find this information valuable. Look to the CAP website for additional information on upcoming webinars, cap.unl.edu. We'll take you to the website and you can find all the information we have about upcoming webinars, past webinar archives, and all of the other information we're publishing on a regular basis. So with all that, we thank you very much for your time and wish you well for the rest of your day.